Hi everyone, this is lecture 4.1. In this one we're going to be looking at who is poor. So we're going to be looking at the identities of poor people basically. Last time we looked a little bit at demographics. Here we're looking at those things that we call intersectional identities. And if you don't know what intersectional identities are, you'll know by the end of this. Additionally, then, we're going to be looking at concepts related to human capital and also cultural capital, and how those go into basically creating how much money you are capable of making in our economy. Each of our lived experiences are shaped by many personal identities. This idea is explained by what's called intersectionality theory, which states that we each possess many identities that are key to who we are. So you have your racial identity, your sexuality, whether or not you are disabled, your nationality, your gender, your religion, your sports team affiliation, on and on and on and on and on, right? Each of us has many, many, many intersectional identities, and they each contribute to making us the person that we are. So some common intersectional identities include race, class, ethnicity, gender identity, sexuality, and religion. Each of these people are who they are or were who they are based on their experience in time and place and their personal intersectional identities. The lower left-hand picture is three men who are presumably, based on historic evidence surrounding that picture, gay in the First World War, right? Certainly that was a unique sort of experience and one very different than many other soldiers. The lady in the upper right-hand corner, again, based on where I pulled the pictures from, is a transgender woman who does construction. That's probably very different than the life that you live. And the woman in the middle is a white Muslim woman who grew up in the United States. Probably pretty different. And not to leave out, the lady in the lower right-hand corner is black and LGBTQ+. Aside from looking at that, we don't really have much more information. Thus, the experiences of poor people of different identities may be different than the experiences of poor people of other identities. Namely, if you're poor and white, you have a different experience than someone who is poor and black, who has a different experience than someone that is middle class, black, and LGBTQ+, right? These are different lived experiences based on where they are in the milieu of the world. Identities interact with each other, and this is what intersections are all about. I kind of already mentioned this. A poor black cisgender heterosexual woman has a different experience than a poor cis heterosexual white woman, and they both have different experiences than that of a poor gay man. Being poor, though, additionally, is another intersectional identity. So let's have some quick notes on terms. When we talk about race, we're talking about a group of people distinguished on perceived physical characteristics. When we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about what distinguishes people from one culture to another. Often there is language included in that. So examples of racial categories in the United States are white, black, and Asian. Excuse me. There are others, but also we have Mexican, Somali, and German. Those are examples of ethnic identities that many Americans have. Now, a nation state, to define this, and it's important to define these things when we're talking about immigration status especially, a nation state is a geographical territory whose population is mostly made up of people of a common cultural identity. And this is most countries in the world. A nation then is a group of people with a common cultural identity, And not all nations control geographic territory. The nation of the Lakota Sioux, that group of Native Americans, they do not control their geographic territory over which they span. And then a state is a geographic territory that a country controls. And this can be confusing for us as Americans because we call our territories within our national boundaries states. On the international scale, a state means the territory of your country. When we talk about sexuality, we're talking about how or if you desire sexual activity. When we talk about gender identity, we're talking about how you interpret your own gender. Examples of sexuality are heterosexual, gay, lesbian, asexual, or pansexual. Examples of gender identity are non-binary, transgender female, cisgender men, transgender male, cisgender male, and gender fluid. Yes, I think I have a slight error in there, but I can't remember where it is. LGBTQ plus people are more prone than the general population to suffer from poverty and homelessness. That's why this is relevant. And this is due to continued social stigma surrounding LGBTQ plus people and families disowning them after they come out. This is especially difficult and especially prevalent among transgender teens. It's a big deal, especially those who are perceived to be male but perceive themselves to be female. Oh, I alluded to that. Transgender teens are the most likely to be disowned and becoming homeless after coming out to their families. If sought out by trans people, hormone therapy, additionally, and surgery can be very expensive, and those treatments are rarely covered by health insurance. So this is another component of how your economic status can have a very real impact on how you are able to experience your gender if these are things that apply to you as a person. As we discussed in our last lecture, the majority of poor people are white, and non-whites do have higher rates of poverty. So people who are in underprivileged racial groups do have disproportionately high rates of poverty, but the greatest number of people who are poor are indeed white people. That's an idea that until I really laid it out and examined it didn't quite make sense to me, but it's really all about a matter of pretty basic statistics and pretty basic numbers of people. Structural racism, we're going to define as elements in our society that reinforce and encourage racial disparities. I'm pretty sure I covered this in a previous lecture, but we'll cover it again. An obvious example is that during the 1930s, ordinance existed that prohibited black people from using certain public facilities in the United States. That's what segregation was. Less obvious examples of structural racism are standardized tests that have repeated issues with questions relying on cultural knowledge that put non-native people at a disadvantage. So an example of that would be that if we were to ask on the SATs a math question like, during a game of football, the Tigers score 4 touchdowns but no extra points, the Sharks score 5 touchdowns with all the extra points tied with those, how many points did the Sharks beat the Tigers by? Now this is, if you know all about football, a pretty okay algebra question. There are some minor problems with it, but it's okay. However, if you didn't grow up in the United States, or even if you did grow up in the United States in an area that didn't really pay attention to football, that places you at a disadvantage. Visible disabilities are also a common matter of intersectionalities. So visible disabilities are more often physical and are those disabilities that we commonly think of. So when you say disability, it may be being blind or very obviously deaf or needing to use a wheelchair or something along those lines. Invisible disabilities then are those that are not readily obvious to people that do not have the disability or the individual. Examples of these can be mental or social disabilities, PTSD, learning disorders, anxiety disorders, major depression, things like autism, things like ADHD, while depending on how a person perceives themselves as someone with ADHD, I don't necessarily always think of it as a disability, but in this definition, it absolutely is an invisible disability in that it can disadvantage me in situations that are built for neurotypical people. Invisible disabilities are often hidden for fear of stigma, right? If somebody doesn't understand how ADHD works, they could act in ways against me that actually, could discriminate in some way. Stigma, then, is a social process and condition in which a group of people is signaled out as being, quote, other. This concept was very well established by prominent sociologist Irving Goffman. In being labeled as, quote, other, members of a stigmatized group are treated differently. And in being treated differently, members of these groups are often treated as inferiors. Stigmatized groups may often be more likely to be scapegoated, as in they are more likely to have problems be blamed on them, right? Thus, people with disabilities often hide those disabilities so that they are not treated differently or are subjects of discrimination. And I alluded to Goffman's book on stigma. He also has another very good book on presentation of self in everyday life. I don't think that's the current cover, but it's a really good book. To fully flesh out the idea, the concept of stigma can be applied to almost all discriminated against groups in society. To put it slightly better, any group that does not enjoy privilege does suffer from stigma inherently. Basically, if there's something about you that you could be discriminated against for, that's probably a subject of stigma. Social class and poverty can absolutely have major impacts on people with disabilities. Healthcare is a major factor in this regard, especially in the United States. Lack of healthcare can also drive people into poverty, especially mental health care for those of us with invisible disabilities. Because healthcare in the United States is typically tied to employment status, people with better jobs are often better able to care for people in their families with disabilities. So this could include things like early intervention, childhood occupational therapy, etc. So if you're born with a disability, whether it be visible or invisible, and your parents are well off, they may be able to help you out to make your life as normal as possible. But if you are born in a disadvantaged situation, your life may be much harder because those early interventions didn't happen. Poor people may be prone to bad qualities of a location. So when we talk about intersectionalities, including a region or location, because if you are in a bad area or you're in an area where a natural disaster occurs or whatever, it takes resources to get away. So you could talk about rural areas and urban areas. There are certainly good rural areas and good urban areas, but when an area really starts to decline, then it really the average of poor people in that area goes up, basically because all of the rich people leave. The percentage of urban What am I getting at here? There is isolation and segregation in inner cities, as is addressed by William Julius Wilson. And then isolation restricts worldview, and young people may not be aware of outside possibilities. This applies to both rural and urban isolated areas. I grew up in a very small town that was relatively poor. I really didn't understand what jobs in the world were possible. I went to college thinking I wanted to be a high school history teacher because that's what I saw, and I liked high school history. The reality of the matter is I'm really glad I didn't wind up being a K through 12 teacher because I have a certain propensity, as you've observed, for using a little bit of extreme examples, and that doesn't usually fly in a lot of K through 12 settings. Additionally, I like my schedule. That's what a lot of it comes down to. So when we're talking about Appalachia, which, as we mentioned, is a poor zone in the eastern United States, we could talk about regional privilege or a regional intersectional identity that ties in with poverty. There is also the regional zone of the Rust Belt, where those areas once had heavy manufacturing in them, but over the last 40 years, that manufacturing has left, leaving these very badly suffering areas. You will observe that the area where I grew up in western Pennsylvania, is an overlap zone between Appalachia and the Rust Belt, and those things combined, right, created those two regional identities combined to create the experience that I had as someone who grew up both in Appalachia and the Rust Belt. Whether you are or are not native born or an immigrant or documented immigrant or undocumented immigrant, these are also matters of intersectional identities. The primary way in the United States that we determine who is and is not a citizen is who was born here and who was not born here. Absolutely, people that come to the United States can become what's called naturalized, but that process is very, very long and costs a lot of money. So you're much better off in the United States if you want to actually immigrate here to have a lot of money ahead of time, to continue making a lot of money while you're here because it costs a lot of money to stay here, and then pay for the whole legal process the whole way through. I have, to the best of my understanding, that process on average takes as maybe around 10 years or so, and I have stories of it taking longer than that. It's not like a simple 6-month thing. Undocumented status may be due to factors outside of the individual's control. Often being undocumented as an immigrant is a matter of poverty. Maybe the person has a pretty low level of education, doesn't really understand the laws of their own country or the laws of the United States, and they simply might not understand the situation. And they can't get clarified on that maybe if they're not fluent in English. However, many people leave their countries out of desperation. A lot of people who immigrate, especially those who do it so-called illegally, do it because they're in a very bad situation. They may be fearing for their lives from a social situation. They may be fearing their government. They may be fleeing from a natural disaster where they had a home yesterday, but today they don't. And a major component there is that poor, undocumented people may not possess the cultural capital to initiate the immigration process. What does that mean? I don't understand the law. I never learned about the law. I wasn't taught English as a second language as part of my private prep school. So I am lacking these knowledge sets. And we'll talk about cultural capital in a moment. A documented foreign national is an immigrant who is from another country but has not been nationalized. This may, may not be seeing. Oh yeah, so there are documented foreign nationals in the United States that are here. They are here for the long term, but they may not be seeking actual United States citizenship. Those people tend to be a little bit better off, again, because that status takes a little bit of doing to make it actually happen. there are all kinds of reasons why people may not choose to become citizens. Sometimes people just have a very strong sentiments for their country of origin, right? And that's understandable. I have a good friend of mine who's lived in the United States for probably 30 years now, and she won't give up her Indian citizenship because that's who she is. That's where she grew up. A naturalized citizen then is somebody that has gone from being an immigrant, coming to the United States, being a full legal citizen. This process can take a very long time. It can be very expensive. I think I've beaten that dead horse. It costs, here's the money, it costs $725 per person just to fill out the paperwork. That's the fee. And that can be a tremendous amount of money if you are in a bad financial situation, and that's just one person. The process can take several years, and then there are also additional legal fees if you have to hire a lawyer, etc. There are many different places that immigrants come from. Major immigrant groups in Ohio include Somali, Afghani, and Nepali people. Also include other Arab people, include people from Mexico, and include other Latinx people, including people from all over South America. And it could well, no, anyway, got a definition messed up. These are basically, if you're in Columbus, Ohio, as part of your education here, these are the immigrant groups in our city. Now let's kind of address these ideas of human capital versus cultural capital. Capital is a fluid resource that may be expected in a variety of ways. Money is one type of capital, but there are other types of capital. Human capital are those attitudes that individuals have acquired that allow them to compete more or less effectively in a given labor market. An alternate definition of human capital is the component of economic production that is tied to human activity and what people can do. So, yes, anyway. Our lived experience dictates our learned behaviors and experiences. Thus, our human capital, our individual human capital, can be based on work experience, can be based on education, can be based on other cultural knowledges, and all of those could be impacted on if we are or are not poor, or grew up not poor. Cultural capital, then, is the set of knowledges, tastes, and preferences that we develop as part of our position in society. And much of our cultural capital is taught to us with the hope that it will help us in the perceived future in social situations. Many schools get very concerned with dress codes, and those dress codes are always based on what the people running those schools think will be their jobs in the future, right? So if very much the polo shirt, khaki pants, they're the dress code of a lot of schools, that is, they expect them to be going into middle class type, either white collar jobs or clerk jobs. That's basically what they're lining them up, is to be in some sort of white collar job. Those uniforms, those outfits those kids are wearing certainly would not be appropriate maybe in a farming situation or a factory situation or as a mechanic, for example. So here's an example of cultural capital, and I'm presuming, especially given the nature of employment in our society, that myself included, all of us will be doing job interviews in the future. That's just kind of how things go. Those pre-official interview chit chats are critical. And it can be hard to really even think about it, but that stuff's super duper and critical. That's when they're figuring out subconsciously what they think of you. So if you were interviewing at Lowe's or maybe another hardware store, and someone asks you, how about them Buckeyes? You could say, I love them. I went to OSU. They would say, I bet you got great tickets when you were a student. Yeah, they were really expensive though, but I went a few times. And then the person says, I bet that was fun, right? That's working class cultural capital. Working class people do tend to have a little bit greater interest in sports than maybe not necessarily middle class people, but often upper class people. And that example is pretty good, an example of working class capital, but the second example is a much better example of upper class capital. You could go to interview at an international law firm. You see this picture of this woman on her desk. And if you have upper class cultural capital, you will recognize both the yellowish building in the background and that glass pyramid as being part of the Louvre in Paris, France, their largest national art and history gallery. And then by recognize it, you could say, oh, when did you go to the Louvre? And then she's seeing that you indeed are like her, because that's what cultural capital is about, is showing somebody, you see, I'm like you want to hire me. That's what we're saying subconsciously. Oh, and she would say, last year, and it was amazing. And then you could say maybe, I know, I studied abroad in my junior year. And then maybe you exchange a little bit of French, right? That is upper class cultural capital, at least how it exists in the United States. And you could see these are things we have in common, right? Often HR people talk about a good fit, right? Well, saying a good fit, that is absolutely talking about cultural capital. Cultural capital helps to reinforce and reproduce the status quo. Thus, if cultural capital is that of a poor community, that cultural capital often discourages people from trying to escape poverty, and that phenomena is called the culture of poverty. So let me say that again to try to make the terms a little easier to use. Poor people's cultural capital reinforces a phenomena known as the culture of poverty. Okay? An example of the culture of poverty can be seen sometimes in how microaggressions occur between somebody who is still in the poor area versus someone who has come home to visit from a not so poor area. Definitely, if any of you grew up in poor areas, you went to school, and then you go back, there's a lot of those types of microaggressions in those sorts of interactions. A microaggression, if you need a definition, is an indirect statement or action that subtly implies aggression against an individual or group of people. A microaggression may be unintentional, and it may be perceived as, quote, just joking around. That's how it's often defended anyway. Here are examples of microaggressions that you may find in the culture of poverty. You come back from college, and someone says, so you think you're better than me now that you went to that fancy school? Or they could say, oh, hey, check it out, it's college boy. They say in a friendly way, doesn't mean it's not a microaggression. I grew up with this, and this drove me crazy. Whenever I would actually be using really any kind of vocabulary that wasn't really low operating, people would say, oh, that's a big word. Yeah, these are the words I have then that I'm using, and it's more accurate, right? Or, and this one really kind of stings for me. I have family members living in my poor hometown that they say to me, why don't you move home? Or when are you moving home? Well, guys, I don't have a job there. There are no jobs for me there because there aren't any jobs for anybody there. There are, in addition to microaggressions, other commonly held myths and ideologies tied with the culture of poverty. The idea of pulling oneself up from their bootstraps is very much embedded in a lot of cultural poverty. This is the belief that someone can start with nothing and has no education and then become successful and rich based only on their own perseverance and hard work. This idea is often backed up by personal anecdotes or stories from friends or family. So I know somebody who worked really hard and now they have a lot of money. That's basically the idea, right? These stories are most often told by people who enjoy privilege, right? So this is a rich person talking about how badly they had it off, and then they try to hype themselves up by telling how very persistent they were in living their life. That is, that's an example of a story of raising oneself up by their bootstraps. The reality is that most individuals who succeed do it with the help of friends, family, and other social structures. A more common example in the culture of poverty is the myth of the American dream. And unfortunately, we have to say this is a myth. The myth is that anyone in the United States can be successful if they work really hard. The reality of the matter is that this is largely dependent on lived situation, and it may not be possible for people of certain groups to succeed, or at least not to succeed in the same way that people that are not in those groups. It may have once been true, the idea that if you work hard in the United States, you can make it. However, discrimination exists in our society, and many of those aspects in our social structure simply are not fair. Other commonly misheld ideologies or ideas or tendencies is that of anti-intellectualism among poor and working class people. We really see this in schools, where it is not cool to be smart or to be intelligent. Why? Well, intellectualism is more of a middle class or upper class value. So intellectualism is reinforced by schools. Thus, schools who are rebelling against the school system, whose parents rebelled against the school system because it doesn't match with their working class values as opposed to the middle class values the schools are espousing, right? And if parents are working class, they may have learned that resentment for intellectual bosses, thus encouraging those resentments in their kids. And this is especially tragic as education is one of the avenues through which poverty can be escaped. Okay, that's it for this lecture, and let me know if you have any questions.